The duel of first contact. The jungle moon of Dravkai was unlike anything Captain Daniel Hayes had ever seen. Towering obsidian trees loomed over the encampment, their bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly under the twin moons. The air was thick with the scent of alien flora and the distant growls of unseen predators. But none of that held his attention now. Instead, his focus was on the ring of massive warriors surrounding him. The Dravani, a warrior race of towering, muscle-bound humanoids, watched in silence. Their red-hued skin bore intricate tribal markings, and their piercing, golden eyes assessed him like a predator sizing up prey. At the center of them all stood Vieshura, the war chief's daughter and the finest warrior of her clan, and she wanted him dead. Daniel had known diplomacy with the Dravani would be difficult. Their culture revolved around strength, and their law dictated that any outsider must prove their worth in combat. His team had barely set up their landing camp before Vieshura had issued her challenge. Now, she stood before him, a wickedly curved spear in hand. Her battle scars only added to her imposing presence. "I do not fight the weak," she announced, voice rich with disdain. "You are small, soft. I will end this quickly." Daniel didn't rise to the bait. He had faced worse in his years as a soldier, but antagonizing an alien warrior in front of her people was not a winning move. Instead, he took a deep breath, keeping his stance relaxed but ready. Vieshura's eyes narrowed. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, she hurled the spear. The crowd erupted into cheers, expecting a swift kill. But Daniel's body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. His hand shot out, snatching the spear from the air. The impact rattled his bones, but he held firm. Silence. The entire assembly froze, their golden eyes wide. Even Vieshura's expression faltered for the first time. Then, the murmurs began. He caught it. The outsider caught the spear. Daniel straightened, still gripping the weapon. Something about their reaction sent a chill down his spine. Vieshura's face darkened, her hands clenching into fists. "You fool," she hissed. "Do you even know what you have done?" Daniel frowned. "I thought the challenge was to prove my worth." Vieshura took a step closer, rage simmering in her gaze. "By catching my spear, you have done more than that. You have claimed me." Daniel blinked. "What?" "The ancient law of the Dravani is clear," a deep voice rumbled. The crowd parted, revealing War Chief Torvek, Vieshura's father. He towered over even the tallest of his warriors, his ceremonial armor adorned with battle-won trophies. His gaze bore into Daniel like a judge passing sentence. To catch a warrior's spear is to accept their challenge completely. You did not evade. You did not deflect. You caught it. This is a sacred sign. You have bested Vieshura in ritual combat. Daniel's gut twisted. He didn't like where this was going. And that means... Torvek's expression was unreadable. "By the laws of our ancestors, Vieshura is now bound to you as mate and battle companion. She is yours forever." Daniel nearly dropped the spear. "Excuse me." The Dravani warriors pounded their fists against their chests, chanting in low, rhythmic tones. The weight of the moment crashed down on him. He had unintentionally engaged in an alien marriage ritual. Vieshura looked murderous. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, turning to her father. "He is human. I will not be shackled to some weak-blooded outsider." Torvek's gaze hardened. "The law is the law, daughter. To reject, it would be to reject your own honor." She bristled, hands clenched, her body trembling with barely contained fury. Daniel, meanwhile, felt like he'd been thrown into an intergalactic prank gone horribly wrong. "I didn't mean to," he started, but Vieshura whirled on him. "You will release me," she growled. "You will break this farce, or I will break you." Daniel met her glare, choosing his next words carefully. "I don't want to force anything, but I'm guessing that backing down now makes me look weak in your culture, doesn't it?" Vieshura's scowl deepened. She said nothing, which was answer enough. Daniel exhaled. This mission was supposed to be about diplomacy, not accidentally marrying an alien warrior princess. But now, his every move would be judged by these warriors. If he refused, he might destroy any hope of an alliance. So, against his better judgment, he tightened his grip on the spear. I'm not backing down. The crowd roared. Vieshira's eyes burned with fury, but also something else. A challenge. And Daniel had just accepted it. A warrior's pride and a soldier's duty. Daniel had faced many difficult situations in his life. Enemy fire, brutal hand-to-hand combat, even surviving in hostile terrain with nothing but a knife and his wits. But nothing compared to the challenge of explaining to an 8-foot-tall alien warrior that he hadn't meant to marry her. The Dravani village was a sprawling network of stone and bone-carved structures, illuminated by fire pits and glowing plants. Daniel sat across from Vieshira in what he assumed was her personal dwelling, though the towering weapons lining the walls made it feel more like an armory. She had barely looked at him since they arrived. Her arms were crossed, muscles tense, jaw tight with restrained fury. "I still do not accept this," she said finally, her voice low and dangerous. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "You think I do?" She snapped her gaze to him, nostrils flaring. "You insult me?" "No," he said quickly, knowing full well that Dravani pride could turn this conversation into a bloodbath. "I'm saying I understand why you're angry. I didn't mean to claim you. I didn't even know what catching that spear meant." Vieshira's lip curled. "Then you are a fool for stepping into a challenge you did not understand." He exhaled through his nose. "That may be true, but here we are. You don't want this. I don't want this. So what do we do?" She narrowed her golden eyes. "The honorable thing would be for you to release me." Daniel frowned. "And how does that work?" Vieshira hesitated. "You would have to publicly declare me unworthy of being your mate." Daniel blinked. "And that's bad." The snarl that followed made it clear just how bad. "I'm the daughter of War Chief Torvek," she snapped. "I have bested warriors twice my size. I have never been called unworthy. You do that, and my honor is destroyed." Great. So rejecting her outright would basically ruin her reputation forever. Daniel sighed. "All right, so that's not an option." Vieshira studied him. "You are human. You do not understand our ways. If you remain here, you will not survive." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I caught your spear, didn't I?" Vieshira bared her teeth. "A fluke." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Then prove it." She tilted her head. "What?" Daniel gestured around the room. "You say I don't belong here, that I'm weak. So train me." Vieshira scoffed. "You are asking me to train you? You think I'm unworthy, right? If I fail, then you'll have your proof that this bond was a mistake." She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she let out a short, sharp laugh. "You are either brave or a fool, human." He smirked. "Probably both." She stood abruptly, grabbing a heavy staff from the wall and tossing it to him. "Then let us see what you are made of." The trials begin. The Dravani did not believe in light training. By the time the sun had begun to rise over the horizon, Daniel's muscles burned in places he didn't know could hurt. Vieshira was relentless. She had started by testing his endurance, forcing him to run up jagged hills, scale rock formations, and push his body to the limit. Then came the combat drills. Dravani warriors fought with a brutal efficiency that relied on raw strength, overwhelming opponents with sheer force. Daniel, while strong for a human, was nowhere near their level. But he was faster, smarter, and he adapted. Vieshira lunged at him with a wooden training spear, aiming for his ribs. He barely managed to pivot, redirecting her strike rather than blocking it outright. She mused, circling him. "You're not as slow as I expected." "High praise," he grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. She smirked. Then, without warning, she swept his legs out from under him. He hit the dirt hard, and yet still predictable, she said. Daniel groaned. "Yeah, I walked into that one." She offered him a hand. He hesitated before taking it. For the first time since the ritual, her expression softened, just slightly. "You are not as weak as I thought." Daniel exhaled. "I'll take that as progress." A shift in perspective. Days passed, and though Vieshira still bristled at the situation, Daniel could tell something was changing. She was testing him, pushing him, waiting for him to break. But he didn't. Every day, he got faster, sharper, and, to his own surprise, he found himself enjoying the challenge. One evening, as they sat by a fire outside the village, Daniel finally asked her, "Why do your people fight so much?" Shira stared into the flames. "We must. The weak are devoured. If we do not fight, we do not survive." Daniel frowned. "So strength is everything?" She nodded. "It is our way." Daniel shook his head. "Where I come from, strength isn't just about how hard you can hit. It's about how well you can adapt, how well you can think." Shira glanced at him. "And yet, you train like one of us." He smirked, because knowing how to fight doesn't mean you have to fight. She was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. "You are different." Daniel chuckled. "You have no idea." For the first time since their bond was sealed, Shira didn't look at him with anger. Instead, there was something else in her gaze. Curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of respect. War on the horizon. The Dravani were not a peaceful people. Daniel had spent weeks proving himself to Shira and her clan, training under her brutal instruction, learning the ways of her people. Though she still called him soft, the way she no longer looked at him with open contempt was a victory in itself. But not all Dravani accepted his presence. And now, one of them wanted him dead. The challenge came at dawn. Daniel stood in the village center, feeling the weight of dozens of golden eyes upon him. The sun cast long shadows as warriors gathered in a wide circle, forming an impromptu arena. At the center stood Karak, a warlord from a rival clan. He was larger than any Dravani Daniel had seen, his red skin etched with deep scars. His eyes burned with fury. "This is an insult." Karak roared, his voice shaking the earth. "A human claims a warrior of the Dravani? This cannot stand." Daniel exhaled. He had expected something like this. Shira had warned him that other clans would see his presence as a disgrace. Still, hearing it firsthand? Not great. Shira stepped forward, standing beside him. Her posture was rigid, her hands clenched into fists. "The law was followed," she said coldly. "He caught my spear. The bond is sealed." Karak sneered. "Then the law is weak. If this human is truly your mate, let him fight for you." The crowd murmured. Daniel tensed. "Let me guess," he muttered to Shira. "If I refuse, I look like a coward." She didn't look at him. "Worse, you will be unworthy. And if that happens," she hesitated, "he has the right to claim me instead." Daniel's blood ran cold. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. "All right then," he said. "Let's get this over with." Shira finally looked at him, her gaze unreadable. Then she gave a single nod. Karak grinned. "Good. At least you are not completely spineless." A spear was placed in Daniel's hands. He could feel the eyes of the entire village on him. No pressure. The duel begins. Karak attacked first. The massive Dravani warrior moved with terrifying speed, thrusting his spear with enough force to punch through steel. Daniel barely dodged, rolling to the side as the tip sliced through the air where he had stood. He needed to be smart. He couldn't match Karak in raw power, but he could outthink him. Karak lunged again, swinging his spear in a brutal arc. This time, Daniel didn't dodge. He stepped in. The move caught Karak off guard. Instead of taking the full force of the swing, Daniel deflected it with his own spear, redirecting the momentum. Karak stumbled slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The crowd reacted, murmuring in surprise. No one had expected him to last this long. Karak snarled, "Tricks will not save you, human." He pressed forward, launching a series of relentless strikes. Daniel parried desperately, his arms screaming from the force of the blows. He needed an opening. Then, Karak made a mistake. Overconfident, he overextended on a downward strike. Daniel saw it and reacted instantly, ducking low and sweeping his leg out. Karak's balance broke. The massive warrior stumbled, and in that moment, Daniel struck. He pivoted, slamming the butt of his spear into Karak's chest with all his strength. The impact sent the larger warrior sprawling. Silence. Karak lay in the dust, stunned. Daniel, panting, planted his spear into the ground. "Yield," Karak growled, pushing himself up. For a moment, it looked like he might continue. But then his golden eyes met Daniel's, and he hesitated. Slowly, grudgingly, Karak placed his hand on his chest, the Dravani sign of surrender. The crowd erupted. Daniel barely had time to process what had happened before Va Shura was at his side. "You won," she murmured, her voice unreadable. He exhaled, adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. "Yeah." Somehow, Karak rose to his feet, his expression dark. But instead of anger, there was something else in his gaze. "Respect. You fight well, human," he admitted. Then his voice dropped lower. "But this is not over." With that, he turned and strode away, vanishing into the crowd. Daniel frowned. "Not over?" That didn't sound great. Va Shura placed a hand on his shoulder, surprising him. "You proved yourself today." He glanced at her. "Did I?" Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. Then she smirked. For now, the weight of what had happened settled over him. He had just fought for his right to be here, to stand beside Va Shura, and he had won. But deep down, he knew Karak's words were true. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Bound by honor, forged by fire. Daniel's victory over Karak had changed everything. The Dravani no longer whispered about him as an outsider who did not belong. Warriors who once scowled at his presence now gave respectful nods as he passed. Even Torvek, the war chief himself, had acknowledged his strength. But not everyone was pleased. Va Shura stood atop the rocky outcrop overlooking the village, her golden eyes locked onto the horizon. The twin moons bathed her crimson skin in pale light, highlighting the tension in her stance. She hadn't spoken much since the duel. Daniel approached, careful not to disturb the quiet between them. He had learned by now that Va Shura wasn't the type to talk unless she wanted to. Still, he had questions. "You're upset," he said finally. Va Shura scoffed. "Upset? No, I am furious." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Because I won?" She turned to him sharply. "Because you should not have had to fight at all." That caught him off guard. "Wait, so you didn't want me to prove myself?" Va Shura's fists clenched. "I did not want Karak forcing the issue. You were already proving yourself, in training, in effort. But Karak, he is no ordinary warrior." Daniel frowned. "He's more dangerous than he let on, isn't he?" She nodded. "He is ambitious. And now, he is humiliated." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So he's not just mad. I made an enemy." Va Shura's jaw tightened. "He will not let this go." Daniel studied her face, noting the way her usual fire had dimmed. "You're worried about me." She bared her teeth. "I do not worry. I anticipate threats." Daniel smirked. "Sound a lot like worrying." Va Shura turned away, clearly frustrated, but didn't argue. That was progress, at least. A gust of wind swept across the cliffs, rustling the trees below. Daniel let the silence settle before speaking again. "What happens now?" he asked. Va Shura sighed. "Karak will not attack in the open. That would be dishonorable, but he will find a way to strike back." Daniel nodded. He had been in situations like this before. Enemies didn't always come at you with a gun in hand. Sometimes they waited in the shadows, striking when you least expected it. "We'll be ready," he said. Va Shura turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We?" He met her gaze. "Yeah, we." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she let out a small, almost amused huff. "You are a strange human, Daniel Hayes." He grinned. "You just figuring that out?" She shook her head, but there was no anger in her eyes. If anything, something in her gaze had softened. And for the first time since their forced bond, she didn't look like she wanted to tear him apart. The fire of betrayal. The attack came 3 nights later. Daniel had been asleep in his small hut when the first explosion rocked the village. The ground trembled, the night sky lighting up in flames. Shouts of alarm echoed through the air as warriors scrambled for weapons. Daniel was already moving. He grabbed the spear Va Shura had given him, throwing open the door. The village was chaos. Firelight flickered off stone walls, warriors shouting orders, children being ushered to safety. And at the heart of it all, Karak. The massive warrior stood at the village gates, flanked by fighters bearing the insignia of a rival clan. His golden eyes gleamed with triumph. "This village is weak," he bellowed, led by fools who would allow a human among them. Daniel's grip on his spear tightened. Vieshura emerged beside him, her own weapon already drawn. Unlike the other warriors, she wasn't confused. She wasn't panicking. She was furious. "You dishonor yourself, Karak," she roared, attacking in the dark like a coward. Karak grinned. "Call what you will, Vieshura. But when this night is over, your people will remember who is truly strong." With a single motion, he raised his fist. The attack began. The battle for honor. Daniel had seen combat before, but never like this. The Dravani fought like monsters unleashed. Raw strength, brutal efficiency. Every movement designed to kill. But Daniel? He'd spent years training in a different kind of war. A human war. And in human wars, strength wasn't everything. It was about strategy. While the Dravani warriors clashed in a chaotic melee, Daniel moved through the battlefield with purpose. He ducked under sweeping strikes, used enemy momentum against them, and struck smart, not hard. And Vieshura was right beside him. She fought like a storm given form, her spears spinning in deadly arcs, her movements precise and unyielding. Together, they carved a path through Karak's forces. Then, at last, Daniel found himself face to face with the warlord himself. Karak sneered. "You should have run when you had the chance, human." Daniel twirled his spear, planting his feet. "Not my style." Karak lunged. Daniel barely dodged, feeling the wind of the strike pass inches from his face. He countered, aiming low, forcing Karak to shift his footing. It was a brutal dance of strength versus speed. Karak was stronger, but Daniel was faster. And little by little, he turned that speed into an advantage. Then, with a final maneuver, he spun low, sweeping Karak's legs out from under him. The warlord crashed to the ground. Vieshura was there in an instant, her spear at Karak's throat. "Yield," she commanded. Karak's eyes burned with fury. But he knew the truth. He had lost. Slowly, reluctantly, he placed a hand on his chest, the Dravani sign of surrender. The battle was over. A warrior's choice. The village stood victorious, though the cost had been high. Fires still burned, and the wounded were tended to. Vieshura stood beside Daniel, her gaze unreadable as she looked over the ruins of the battle. "You fought well," she said finally. Daniel smirked, "Getting better every day." She turned to him, studying him in that intense way of hers. Then, before he could react, she placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You are no longer just human to me, Daniel Hayes," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "And what am I then?" Her lips curled slightly. "Mine." And for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure if he wanted to argue.